This is Ann Stern at the Lakes Church, and we're talking today about Hebrews chapter 1. Now, when I read through this, the verse that really struck me was verse 3. And this verse says, "The Son reflects God's own glory, and everything about him represents God exactly. He sustains the universe by the mighty power of his command. After he died to cleanse us from the stain of sin, he sat down in the place of honor at the right hand of majestic God." So today we're just going to talk about the first sentence in that. So the Son reflects God's own glory, and everything about him represents God exactly. So the way that we figure this out is if we look at the Gospels, we can see Jesus in person and how he related to people and what his personality is and how he functioned in the world. And that shows us exactly a reflection of God our Father. So the first thing that struck me when thinking about Jesus is Jesus collected imperfect people. You know, his disciples were not all perfect. They weren't people who had gone to the university or anything like that. Peter, for example. Peter was a hothead. When the Roman soldiers came to get Jesus out of the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter actually sliced the ear off one of the Roman soldiers. He was uneducated. You know, he was a fisherman by trade. Then we have Thomas. Thomas seemed like he had a little anxiety, and he was a doubter. And then, can you imagine spending 3 years with Judas when you knew that he was the person that was going to betray you? And then there was Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. There was probably no one who was more hated in the land than what Matthew was. You know, the tax collectors kind of turned against their own people to work for the Romans. And when they collected taxes, not only did they collect the tax that the Romans wanted, but they collected a little bit on the side so that they had a great life. So Matthew was a rich man. You know, he had nice clothes, decent shoes. And when he'd walk through the marketplace, people would spit. So the people that Jesus hung out with were definitely not the creme de la creme. When we think about Jesus and we think about his character, now Jesus is compassionate. He's loving, he's merciful, he's kind. Jesus healed every single person that came to him. Every one of them. He healed the blind. He healed the deaf. He healed people that were paralyzed. He even healed people that had friends come and ask for healing. For example, I think about the time that the Roman officer came and talked to Jesus, and he said, "You know, I am not worthy to have you come into my home. But I know, because I'm an officer, I know if I tell one of my men to go do this or go get me that, I know that it will be done." And he said, "I know that if you just say your servant will be healed, just say that word, and my servant will be healed." The other thing, another one that he healed was he would heal lepers. Well, I can just see him walking down the road with his band of followers, and all of a sudden in the distance they see a leper coming toward them. And they say to him, "Jesus, don't touch him. Don't breathe his air." Kind of like the coronavirus. But leprosy was way worse. With leprosy, I mean, your nose would rot off or your fingers would drop off. So it was seriously bad. Well, Jesus, instead of staying away, he walked up to the leper and he laid his hands on him. Can you imagine how that felt to that leper? And all of a sudden, he became clean again. Those things had to be just, can you imagine how their lives changed? It was just amazing. You know, Another thing that shows us the character of God is, Jesus cares about our daily needs. When he was out preaching and teaching out in the areas, there were times that he would retreat into the wilderness. And sometimes the people found out where he went and they would follow him. So he would end up in a place that was far away from towns, and he'd have this giant crowd of people. And, I think about the time that he fed the 5,000. Well, 5,000 was just the men. Then you had the women, you had the children. So, I don't know, he maybe fed 20,000 during that time period. But he cared. He knew those people were hungry, and he cared for their daily needs. Another thing that I think about is, I think of when he went to the wedding, and he's at the wedding, he's having a good time with his followers, and all of a sudden his mom came up to him, and she said, "Jesus, they're out of wine." And I can see him turning to her and say, "So what do you want me to do about that?" And I know that she gave him the mom eye. She went, and he would have said, "Mom, it's not my time." And she would have went, and he turned the water into wine. I think too about how exhausted Jesus probably was throughout his ministry. If we look at that story where he's in a boat and he's headed to the other side of the lake with his disciples, he falls asleep in the back of the boat, and a giant storm comes up. And he's so exhausted, he is sleeping right through that. And I can just see, he cares so much about our daily needs that when they woke him up, he turned and he calmed the sea so that they felt at peace. He cares about what we're concerned about. Jesus loves everyone equally. In Jewish society, it was patriarchal. Women were property, and a woman was owned first by her father and then by her husband. But Jesus didn't treat them like that. Jesus treated them the same no matter what they were. It brings to mind the story of the woman at the well. So in Jewish society, the Pharisees, they were at the top. They were in all their fancy robes, and, they acted like they were holier than everyone else. They were very concerned about what their look was on the outside, but inside their heart was rotted. But people saw them at the top of society. Well, the woman at the well was about as low as you could possibly get. First of all, she was a woman. Second of all, the Samaritans and the Jewish culture did not get along. They had attacked each other's temples. There was very bad blood between them. So she was a woman, she was a Samaritan, and besides that, on top of everything, she had been married 5 times. And the man that she was living with then was not her husband. So Jesus met her. He went and sat at the well at noon. Now, most women went and collected their water in the morning, but because of her many sins, she had to go at noon. Jesus chose that person to be the person that he proclaimed himself as Messiah to. He didn't care about what your status was in the community. He used everyone. Another example is children. In Jewish society, children were not really valued. It's not like it is today where, we're all over our kids. They really didn't think children were that important until they were grown up a bit. But not Jesus. When the disciples were trying to protect him again and keep him from being too tired. The parents were bringing their children to him to be blessed. And instead of turning them away, he welcomed them and even told the disciples, let these little children come to me. And he taught us that we need to have a faith like that of children who are so trusting and so loving. That's the type of relationship he wants us to have with him. Now, Jesus also experienced some righteous anger. And we know that God experiences righteous anger. For example, when Jesus went to the temple and he saw the money changers there. Now, money changers were there to sell little animals, or maybe big animals, to people as they came into the temple. And in the Jewish society, they felt that when they went to God, in order to have their sins forgiven, they would transfer their sins to these animals, and then the animal would be killed as an offering to God to atone for their sin. Well, when he went in and he saw the exorbitant prices that the money changers were charging, it made him so angry, because these people were just there to worship God, and now all of a sudden they were being taken advantage of. Kind of like an $8 beer at the Packer game. So Jesus got very angry about that. Pharisees, he referred to them as a brood of vipers. And because they were all about status and they were all about power. Don't touch me, I'll be unclean. When really, it wasn't what came to them that made them unclean. It was their rotten hearts that made them unclean. Another thing that we see in the Gospels is that Jesus forgives. Jesus was whipped. He was beaten. He was tortured. He was scorned. He was humiliated. And he's hanging there on that cross in just severe, severe pain. I'm sure every part of his body just burned with pain. And yet, he looked down at the people that were scoffing and making fun of him. And he said to his Father, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So he is able to forgive whatever it is that you have done. All you have to do is ask. Jesus is truth. When Jesus was questioned by Pilate, Jesus had told Pilate that he came, his purpose was to bear witness to the truth. God is truth. There's absolutely no truth that exists outside of God, because something is the truth because God basically is the author and the very definition of truth. So when we look at this, to sum it up, God uses imperfect people. He's compassionate. He's loving. He's kind. He's forgiving. He doesn't pay attention to status or social classes. He forgives, and he is the truth. Thank you for joining me today. Signing off from the lakes.